Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 2 game from the New York International. Now, if you followed the round 1 video, you know that I drew my first game against an untitled player around 2000, and I was hoping to kind of show up in this game because that was actually a major disappointment, especially with the white pieces. So by virtue of drawing down, I was going to play down again. And my opponent in this one was another untitled player by the name of Zong. Now, I actually was familiar with Zong. I don't think I'd ever played him before, but I was familiar with him because he's a young, talented junior that hangs around the Marshall Chess Club and plays a lot of tournaments there. And he was actually born in 2006, so he's only 13 years old and has shown quite a bit of promise. I see a lot of his games, and he seems to know what he's doing for the most part. So I knew this would be a tough test. And a lot of times when you're playing juniors in the United States, they're actually terribly underrated because there aren't enough FIDE rated events for them to play. So even though his FIDE rating said something along the lines of 2100, I knew better than to just trust that figure because a lot of times they are maybe 200 points away from their actual strength. Any case, I was black, so let's get into it. So David's opened with d4, and I went d5, and then c4, e6, and after knight c3, knight f6, we have a queen's gambit decline type of position. Now, it's kind of unclear what variation he would go for. I wasn't sure if he would go for an exchange or play knight f3 or e3, or I wasn't quite sure what line he would play. And he went for bishop g5. And bishop g5 gives me a few choices, but I wanted to kind of keep the position relatively solid. And so I actually opted for bishop e7. And after e3, castles, knight f3, and h6, white actually played the move bishop h4, and this is actually the first kind of major choice that I have with black, because if I want, I can go for the Lasker variation. Now, the Lasker in this position is actually the move knight e4, and it's characterized by a series of exchanges, particularly the trade of these bishops. And then usually after that, not queen d3, normally like bishop d3, then normally there's the trade of knights. And, even though white has a little bit more space, black has actually traded a few minor pieces and typically puts his bishop on b7 and has a relatively solid position. But I didn't want to necessarily trade a bunch of pieces from the jump and decided to keep a little bit more tension on the board and go for a variation with a little more pieces. So instead of playing the Lasker variation with knight e4, I went for b6. And b6 is, I believe, called the Tartakower-Bondarevsky variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. And the idea is that you put the bishop on b7, the knight on d7, and play for c5 without this early knight e4, so there's a little bit more pop in the resulting positions. White now went bishop d3. This has been played before. I went bishop b7, and after castles, I went knight bd7. Again, we're both kind of keeping the tension on the d5 and c4 pawns. Neither side really wants to release that tension prematurely. And after queen e2, I actually played c5. And so the idea here is all my pieces are actually quite well placed to meet these pawn tensions in the center. So if white, for instance, took on c5, I could take with the pawn, sure, and actually get a nice center, but I also could take with the knight. And you can see my knight would be jumping on this bishop on d3, trying to get the bishop pair. And my bishop on b7 would be extremely active and well be able to easily meet the pressure on this diagonal after d takes c4 is played. So black would actually potentially get the upper hand here in positions like this. And it's because basically black's pieces are all really well placed for the center to open up now that I'm probably going to recapture with a pawn or a piece on these squares. Same thing as if c takes d5 is played, I'd probably go knight takes d5. And after bishop e7, I can actually start with knight takes c3 if I wanted to. And again, my bishop is now on the long diagonal. My knight is supporting the c5 pawn if need be. I might have counterplay with rook a c8 against the c pawn. And black is just, has a very playable position here. So after c5, I thought, okay, I'm doing pretty well. I'm probably going to have some good pawn tension here. And if white doesn't actually exchange either way, I might be able to create an isolated pawn. So we'll get into it a little bit later, but that's actually what wound up happening is white didn't actually resolve the tension in the middle because he didn't want to activate one of my minor pieces. And as a consequence, I actually was able to exchange on the D file before white was, and I messed up his structure. So anyways, here white actually played a move that's, in my opinion, a slight mistake, even though it had been played a lot before in the database. It's the move Rook FD1. And in my estimation, there is some logic to this from the standpoint that the rook is kind of lined up against my queen on D8. So if some of these pieces get cleared, there might be some tactical vulnerabilities connected to that. But the issue is that I actually can contest in the center first, and this actually gives me that opportunity. Instead, I think there are a few better moves. One is actually just C takes D5. Now, again, it's not ideal to resolve the tension in the center, but at least here, after knight takes D5, bishop E7, this line I just went into, at least black, at least white has a relatively stable center and doesn't have any weaknesses necessarily. Because what happened in the game is white was actually saddled with some really, unfortunate weaknesses. Another move that's actually quite playable is Rook AC1. And the point is, maybe you get some counterplay on the C file if things open up. But Rook FD1 allowed me to play the move C takes D4. And this move, in my opinion, causes a little bit of a crisis in white's position because you love to take with the knight on D4, but if you take with the knight, all of a sudden the E5 and C5 squares are sensitive, and it allows my knight to jump into one of them. And I'd actually jump in with knight E5 because in addition to attacking the C4 pawn, I'm also threatening to win a bishop. So because of that threat, white is going to wind up giving up the bishop pair, and this constitutes an advantage for me, especially with this bishop on B7 lurking on that diagonal. So for instance, if C takes D5 is played, I think after knight takes D3, queen takes D3, and now knight takes D5, I believe even after some of these exchanges that black has a slightly more pleasant position in the sort of bishop versus knight scenario that would exist right now. Now you might say, well, maybe white can block out the bishop on this diagonal with F3, but F3 actually weakens some dark squares, and I'm not totally convinced that solves the problem. I just believe the bishop is better than the knight in this resulting structure. So that's one issue if you play knight D4. The other issue is if you play the move E takes D4, as was played in the game, you're actually potentially saddled with an isolated pawn. And as we know, the isolated pawn is a short-term asset and a long-term liability. It's a short-term asset because it, gives white a little bit more space to potentially attack on the king side, but it's a long-term liability because in the endgames, it's easy to pick off and play around. And it doesn't really hit anything, so it's kind of not a strength by itself. Another thing to note is I actually did kind of force this isolated pawn exchange, but actually after Rook FD1, Knight E4 is actually a very, very nice and playable move. And the idea is that I'm actually taking advantage of the bishop on H4 being loose, and after Bishop E7, Queen E7, there's actually kind of a crisis even in this position because white can actually take on E4 with the knight because then after D takes E4, there's a fork on the bishop on D3 and the knight on F3. And so this knight being here is quite an annoying wedge, and it's well supported by the bishop and the pawn, and even here black has pretty active play. So really this Rook FD1 move allowed multiple options, and I just went for the most reasonable or most logical one with C takes D4 and got a pretty decent position. So after he takes D4, I actually went Rook C8. An argument actually could be made for taking on C4 right away, but I thought there was no need to relinquish this pawn tension right away because I thought I could essentially play against an isolated pawn at any juncture. I thought that a move like B3, reinforcing the pawn structure and maybe not, making sure the d pawn isn't isolated would still give white hanging pawns, and I thought that could be a real target as well. So for instance, if after rook c8, which I played, if b3, I thought there's scenarios where even this position, if d takes c4, b takes c4, would be kind of suspect for white, because the c4 pawn is a little sensitive in some lines, and now these dark squares are a little bit weaker because the b pawn has been pushed and traded on c4, so some of these dark squares are loose, and you can see the knight on c3 is a bit insecure because it's unprotected. So yeah, so those were some of the dynamics I thought that made rook c8 justifiable. Another way to play would actually have been to play d takes c4 right away. And the point is that after bishop takes c4, I could play a6 and try to threaten b5. And if I'm able to destabilize the bishop on c4 with b5, I might also be able to destabilize the knight with an eventual b4 push. And black seems to be doing okay there. But d5 becomes playable in a position like this. And this is another thing I was worried about, is giving the rook the opportunity to have some tactics on the d file with the queen still on d8. And this wouldn't be super clear. So again, I just thought it'd be better to keep tension. So anyways, after rook c8, white now actually took on d5, and that's actually kind of the dream scenario for me, because I basically saved myself a tempo and activated my rook on a half-open file, since he decided there was nothing to do but release the tension. And I actually think this is a huge mistake, because it actually kind of helps facilitate my play. Instead, I mean, it's difficult to do, but a move like bishop g3 would have been a little bit more logical. And you can see from my arrows that the bishop is actually pretty effective on the h2 b8 diagonal, and the d6 square could potentially be sensitive after a knight b5 move. Also, the pawn on a7 might also be a little sensitive, and so, with the bishop on this diagonal covering b8 and a7 hanging, there are sometimes knight b5 takes a7, which is kind of annoying, and then the knight can kind of like hit and run and then come back to b5. So bishop g3 would have been a little bit better, although black is also fine here. Instead, after c takes e5, I now am keen on keeping the blockade on the d4 pawn, so I took with a piece with knight takes d5, and this precipitates a series of exchanges that actually makes the isolated pawn more of a liability. That's the other thing about the bishop dropping back to g3, is that you're actually able to keep minor pieces on the board. Now, after c takes d5 and knight takes d5, the bishops are going to come off the board very quickly, and so are a pair of knights. So white started with queen e4, which is a nice little intermediate move threatening checkmate on h7, but it can easily be parried with the move g6. I calculated this, and then there's no more threats here, and there's still some tensions in the position. And so bishop takes f7, bishop takes e7 was played. I played queen takes e7, and now knight takes d5 was played. And after bishop takes d5, queen e3 backing up attacks my h6 pawn. But now after king g7, you could just see that black has a really nice positional edge. Essentially, I have 2 pawn islands, and white has 3 because of this isolated pawn on d4. And the other issue with the isolated pawn for white is that it actually allows me to kind of play around it effectively, and this rook on d1 is not really doing anything here. The hope that white possibly had was by playing rook d1 that the file would actually open up, but now you can see it's actually completely useless there, and would much rather be on e1 or c1. So that's the other thing, is that my rook is already on a open file that can essentially play on it, whereas white's isn't. And it's kind of another indicator of why rook fd8 rook fd1 was ill-advised for white early on. Even though, again, in the database, I think it had been played like 10 or 11 times. So anyways, after king g7, I'm already thinking about ways to kind of trade a few more pieces to make the d4 pawn more weak. And after a3, I thought this was like kind of a prophylactic move covering the a2 pawn. A little bit slow in my estimation, but I think he wanted to play rook ac1 but didn't want to drop a2. But after a3, I actually just played bishop takes f3. And you might say, what do you mean that bishop on d5 was so wonderfully cementing the d pawn in its place, and you're now trading bishop for knight? What is this? Aren't you breaking some rules here? Well, the issue is that this knight is the only piece that could kind of hop around and like do stuff in white's position. And I thought this bishop here is biting on granite with my pawns being on light squares. So after the exchange on f3 and queen takes f3, I thought now with queen d6, I could put my knight on f6. My knight might come to d5 and replace that bishop. And I thought here I'd have a really, really nice pressure because the bishop doesn't really have an effective diagonal here. Now, I could have, waited a little bit more before doing that exchange, tried to build up with rook fd8 or something like that. But I thought knight e5 might give white some chances of drawing and at least some active counterplay on the king side with potentially knight g4 coming and targeting h6. So I just thought getting rid of that one active piece meant I'd essentially be playing a two results game where I would either win the game or I'd draw the game. So after queen takes f3, queen d6, white is actually in real trouble because now not only is the d4 pawn going to be a permanent target with my queen eyeing it, I can very easily line up my pressure on the d file and then put this knight on f6, and my king is totally secure behind this beautiful wall of pawns and a knight that can kind of hop around and maybe inflict another weakness in the white camp. After queen d6, white played queen e3, protecting the d4 pawn. A tiny bit slow in my opinion, but I understand why he's defending this. And now I went knight f6, and you can see I have multiple ideas. One is to put my knight on d5. One is just to keep building with rook fd8. And now white actually decided to play bishop e2, prophylactically defending the d4 pawn or overprotecting it with the rook on d1 as well as the queen on e3, and also in some lines considering rerouting this bishop to f3, where it would actually be on a new diagonal where it's actually doing something, and at least eyeing the square in front that's actually blockading the d pawn. In many respects, the most important thing about isolated pawn positions winds up being the square right in front of it, because that's where all of the attention of the blockader is. So it makes sense that the bishop comes around to potentially challenge d5. But after bishop e2, I went rook fd8. And I have a very simple plan of, basically going for Alekhine's gun on the d file, or even potentially doubling on the c file and going knight d5. And I think one of the things that kind of illustrates that is that if you go for bishop f3, trying to, again, control this d5 square, I actually now can infiltrate with rook c2, and I'm just, getting a little bit of an initiative here because I'm hitting b2. If you push the b pawn, you're actually weakening a lot of squares on the c file, and I might potentially just double. And frankly, even here, there are some problems for white. Note that if you try to play d5, which is a nice attempt to try and break up the blockade, I actually can just take it and it's a free pawn. But if I thought that that white was maybe getting a little bit of counterplay for it and my pawn is a little isolated, I can also even consider pawn e5. And even in this scenario, black would be better because I can blockade this pawn effectively on the dark squares and just to have a little bit more counterplay than white has. So pretty much any way you slice it, white is going to be suffering. So anyways, after rook fd8, white actually played rook ac1. And yeah, I thought this was kind of a weird move at first because it would appear that this is hanging the d4 pawn. And so, but actually I played knight d5. The reason I did that is if I take on c1, I noticed actually that rook takes c1 wouldn't be played because I could take on d4. Instead, queen takes c1 would be played, and his hope is maybe this queen gets to play on the c file and the d pawn is still covered, and he still has bishop f3 as an idea. So I decided to keep the tension a little bit more instead of capturing on c1 because I saw it didn't net a pawn, and I went for the move knight d5. This was an important move in my opinion because I'm able to get the knight to the square before the bishop is actually on f3 and can take it. And basically, it just gives me that time to preserve my knight and hop around still, while also, asking a question to the queen about what you're going to do. And one of the things I saw in this position is that the f4 square looked really, really appealing to my knight, just because in some lines there were forking opportunities, and it just seemed like a really nice square on f4. So I actually invited a queen trade with queen e5 check, but which would actually theoretically make his pawn on the d file not isolated anymore. But the idea was that I'd actually trade one advantage for another, and we'll see that in a moment. After knight d5, queen e5 check actually was played, and after queen takes, d takes, rook takes c1, and then rook takes, I actually played knight f4. And you could say here, well, what happened? There was an isolated d pawn before, now there isn't. Hasn't white corrected their structure? Theoretically, yes, he has corrected his structure a little bit, because the e pawn is definitely not as weak as it was on d4. But the flip side is I've traded one advantage for another. So I traded my structural advantage for an activity advantage, because all of a sudden my knight is running rampant in the white camp, and my rook gets to infiltrate on the d file before white is actually ready. And note that white's king is actually still kind of weak and has back rank issues, because he hasn't made luft for his king. So at the moment, tactically, it is actually an extremely, extremely difficult position to defend, and that's what I was banking on. And one of the things that good chess players do is they trade one advantage for another. They recognize that you can't necessarily cling to something for something forever. You decide to get something even better. So after knight f4, there's already a tough decision for white, because you're kind of thinking, what do I do with my bishop? White played bishop f1 to just defend it prophylactically like that, and also make sure to kind of dominate the knight still and some of the squares it could jump to. But note that a move like king f1, I'd respond with rook d2, and this double attack on e2 and b2 is devastating. It's really, really tough, because not only is rook takes b2 an option, there's also knight d3 if the bishop moves off of this diagonal. So for instance, let's say bishop f3 is played. Well, I could consider knight d3, but I'd probably go rook takes b2, and knight d3 is a threat, and rook a2 is a threat, getting at the a3 pawn, and this position is just winning. So yeah, so very, very, you already have to be extremely careful, and bishop f1 is fine. But after bishop f1, I go rook d2, and the same problems exist. b2 is hanging. F2 might be sensitive at some point, although the knight is being covered now because bishop takes d3 would be played. Sometimes even e5 is a problem. So a lot of problems here. g3 was played now, challenging that knight on f4. And I have a few squares I can go to. I can go to e2, d3, or d5. Why don't you think on this one and try to determine what the best square for the knight is? All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what you think the best square for the knight is. I thought the best square for the knight was knight e2 check. And this, if you again, aren't necessarily great at endgames, or you've been kind of following the trend of this game, you might say, what are you doing? Aren't you trading your knight that's super active and was running rampant for this bishop that's kind of passive? Yes, I am, but the point is I'm actually trading one advantage for another. And what I recognize is after the exchange of knight and bishop here, this rook endgame is still extremely unpleasant because his pawns are more targets than mine. And I basically recognized that I'd net at least one pawn, and this king would be extremely passive, still being on the back rank. So after rook takes e2, he pretty much has to decide which pawn he wants to preserve, and he decided after rook c7 that he was going to save the b pawn, because after I played a5, covering my a pawn, note that if he attacks the b pawn, I'm just going to take his b2 pawn. So instead, he went b4, and after a takes b4, rook takes e5. now an endgame has arisen where I'm a pawn up, and it's very, very difficult to defend this position because essentially, if my king ever is able to get active, the b pawn will be very, very difficult to defend, and white need to try and maximize his activity to defend, but it's very difficult for his king to centralize itself because all of a sudden some of his pawns will be targets. So pretty much Davis is in a position where he's can only draw the game at best and has to deal with a very, very difficult defense. And I can essentially torture him for a long, long time. And I figured that trading some of the advantages I had before would be worth playing a position potentially for another 20, 30, 40 moves where, he pretty much has to be on his toes on every move. And so just getting a sense of when it's good to trade certain advantages for others is important. So anyways, after rook takes e5, the threat here is actually rook e4. And, if you play b5, then I can even go rook b4 and actually just take on b5. And so you can't be 2 pawns down because then it's definitely losing. So he has to try and hold the pawn, and he does that by playing rook c6, which is a good move. Attacking the b6 pawn, challenging it. And now I have a question of how to defend this pawn because I can go rook b5 or I can go pawn b5. And it's actually very, very important that I go rook b5. It's a huge, huge thing because if I go pawn b5, he actually can get his rook behind the pawn with rook b6. And now my rook on e5 is actually a little bit passive because I can't actually attack the b4 pawn without hanging my own. So it's very important that my rook is an attacker and a defender simultaneously. And that's why I played rook b5. Very, very critical. Now rook c4 is played, defending the pawn, and it's not losing just yet because, again, I have to try and create some other weakness or get my king involved or something like that to actually get a decisive advantage. But it is important now that this rook on c4 is purely a defender and not actually challenging anything in my camp. And if I'm able to maintain that status quo, I'll win the game. So now I got to improve on the king side, and I decided to play g5. I want to take a little bit more space on the king side if I can, because then my pawns are aren't really as more significant targets, and my king can start to walk over. So that's the plan, is to take some space on the king side, and then when my pawns are sufficiently pushed, then my king can walk over, and maybe the rook will not be able to attack my pawns because they'll be a little bit more advanced and easily protected by my rook, and maybe the b pawn will drop. And after g5, white played h4, which is a reasonable move, challenging my expansion. If white is extremely passive and plays a move like, let's say, king f1, if I go h5 and then he goes h4, now I'll go g4. And if he tries to go f3, I'll go f5. And now fixing these pawns on the king side and kind of taking more space makes this position very, very perilous for white, because if he lacks space and he's down material, he can slowly get squeezed and my king can start to come in the game. So just need to be a little bit wary with white to not allow black to take all the space, and h4 does accomplish that, because now I can't play h5 because my pawn is hanging and I don't want to break up my pawns. And I can't go g4 because my pawn is not on h5. So h4 is a good move. Now I actually played rook d5, kind of patiently waiting and keeping the tension. And in some lines, I'm actually entertaining b5 as a threat, destabilizing the rook on c4. So let's say king f1 is played. If I go b5, you have to keep the rook on the 4th rank, because if you go like rook c6 now and try to go behind the pawn, well, I'd actually take on h4 first, because now after g takes h4, now I have rook d4, and I'm picking up a second pawn, and you can't even take my b6 pawn because I'll take this one like that. And again, 2 pawns up in these endings, I'm just winning. So I played rook d5 with the threat of b5, and in this position, white actually has really only one move to stay in the game, and unfortunately for my opponent, he missed it. The move to stay in the game here is actually rook c6. And the idea is that, again, I don't want to play b5 because then after rook b6 comes, my rook is purely defensive and can't actually attack b4 because it has to guard this pawn. And so white could start with h takes g5, and after h takes, then rook b6. And you can see my rook can't actually step up. And as long as this rook is on like b7 behind the pawn and is harassing this one and can simultaneously harass my kingside pawns, this will probably be a draw with best play. Now, it's very hard to still defend this. I can improve a lot. I can go king f6. Let's say I can go g4. I can still kind of execute a squeeze, but and maybe even rook f5. Maybe I can even something like this would be very unpleasant because now I'm holding up his break. My rook on f5 might eventually protect my pawn f7, and maybe my king could swing around and start to get active. But this would be the way for white to try to defend. Instead, my opponent wasn't completely alert to this idea of b5, and also the idea of making sure that my rook stays on b5. That's actually the biggest thing, is that make sure my rook is my rook doesn't get active. He actually played h takes g5, and believe it or not, this move is actually the losing move. It's amazing. It's just a simple pawn recapture, but the issue is that with h takes g5, I don't have to worry about a pawn tension that didn't allow me to kind of take more space on the king side. In the previous position, I wasn't able to I always had to worry about h takes g5, and it didn't allow me to expand with g4 and h5. But now after the exchange with h takes g5 and h takes g5, I actually can consider expanding with f5 and king f6 and g4 because there's no longer this tension that exists from h4 to g5. And so this position, believe it or not, is completely losing. And it's just an amazing, amazing thing because you think it's just a natural exchange to resolve tension, but that tension was the source of white's counterplay. And I think the way I continue the game from here is actually quite instructive because I just slowly build and improve until it's just winning. So white played rook c6 now, getting at the b6 pawn, but now that I don't have to worry about this tension, it's just not as effective. Because now after rook c6, rook b5, and rook c4 back, now I go king f6. And I now have this very simple plan of walking my king over to d5. Note that before, this might not have been possible because the rook could come over and hassle the g5 pawn. And again, I never wanted to take on h4 by itself because then my h6 pawn would have been isolated and weak. So I couldn't just run my king over when this tension existed. But now there's no tension on the g5 pawn, so I can run it over. So after king f6, king f1, king e5, king e2, now the first part of my phase is the first phase of my plan is done to kind of activate the king. Now the next phase is kind of just take some more space. So I start with king d6 now. This actually stops rook c6 from being played, right? Or rook c7 harassing my kingside pawns or my b pawn. And now my rook is free to roam. g4 is played, trying to kind of fix my pawn g5, but actually kind of fixes white's pawns in some way because now this f pawn is kind of backwards. That doesn't actually solve anything. It would have been a better try and actually exchange the pawns, but this is also quite difficult because if you go for a move like f4, I actually can go g4, and I still have a pretty nice space advantage here, and the g3 pawn is fixed as a weakness. So even here, it's tough. But anyways, after g4, I now went rook d5, and you can see now that b5 becomes a threat because the king is close enough to the b pawn where it can't be a target, and the rook can't target f7. So huge problem here. After rook d5, white played king e3, and I went rook d1. Not rushing with b5, not because I don't have to. I don't need to force the rook to get behind my pawn right away. So I thought it'd be better to improve my own rook and maybe have it on b1 before I push through with b5. Note that rook d4 check, just trying to trade the rooks, is losing because I'm a pawn up in a pawn endgame. So that is not possible. After rook d1, white played f3, just reinforcing this pawn structure. And now I went for rook e1 check, just harassing the king. And after king d2, I went rook b1. And you can see I actually wanted to go to b1 the whole time. But the point is, by destabilizing this king a little bit, forcing it to make a decision, it's now the f3 pawn is a little bit loose, and I get to play rook b3 with tempo. And so it's just one of those things where you check to destabilize and then go where you actually want to go. And so, yeah, just a nice little maneuver there. And now after rook b1, white now went king e3 back, and you can see how he kind of had to waste time to do this. And now I go e5. And with e5, now the f4 square is permanently lock and key controlled by my pawns, and the f3 pawn is fixed as a weakness. And white almost has no moves because now this rook is tied to defending the b4 pawn, but it only has one square on the file. And you can see I've maximized the activity of all my pieces, even with the limited material, and it's just extremely unpleasant. King d2 is played, but now I went b5, challenging the rook on c4 and the b4 pawn. And after rook e4, only move to protect the b pawn, I went rook b3, and now the f3 pawn is attacked. And king e2 was played, and the position is nearly total domination, right? The rook on e4 has no squares to go to except e3, but on e3 we trade to a winning king and pawn endgame, or I just collect a second pawn with rook takes b4. The king is cut off on the third rank, and white can't move his pawns. So I kind of, being a pawn up and having to defend this unpleasant position, I've kind of twisted his pieces into a pretzel. And yeah, it's very painful. Actually, if I was him, I would have resigned at this juncture. But, the young players tend to play on. And so I went f6, just improving my pawns now. No need to rush. And after king f2, king d5. And now my pawns are actually protected. My plan now is just to go rook d3 and rook d4, and then I'll try and either force a trade of the rooks on the fourth rank or walk my king in and secure the b4 pawn. After king g3, I went rook b2, which I thought was a nice kind of torturing move because now the king on g3 can't even come out to the f file, so it's relegated to h3. And the rook can't move either. So the only move that doesn't lose material right now is king h3, and I thought that was just kind of funny. So I thought he might resign with rook b2, so that's why I played it. I thought it was a nice little torturing move before I go for the rook d4, rook c4 plan. But after king h3, he kept playing, and so I went rook d2 now. And after rook e1, I went rook d4, and you could see now that the b4 pawn is going to drop. Rook b1 was played. I went king c4, and now I'm just going to go king c3 to take it next move. And after king g3, king c3, rook c1 check, king takes b4, rook c8, rook f4. Now just, protecting my f pawn as well and preventing him from even getting even a little bit of counterplay. Note that if the king tries to come out and support the defense of the b pawn marching, I actually just have e4 because he walks into a pin. So it's just a torturous position. But after rook e8, now I went king c3, and I'm just shuttling my pawn up the board. And white played king f2, b4, rook c8 check, and then rook c4. And here my opponent finally resigned. Interesting rook endgame, I think. I think it was kind of instructive from the standpoint of, essentially having one advantage, trading it in for another advantage, right? So I essentially had the isolated pawn. I had a better pawn structure, right? And I was playing against the isolated pawn. And then I traded knight for bishop, which is, I traded my bishop for his knight, which is very unusual because I recognized that I'd get activity. And then once I had the piece activity, I actually traded my active knight for his passive bishop to get to a rook endgame, a pawn up. And then when I was in the rook endgame, a pawn up, then I started to kind of work my magic and slowly grind and improve until he eventually capitulated. So just kind of exploring those themes of converting one advantage to another is really important, and I'm glad I was able to do it here. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel, and if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again, and take care.